Today is the first session out of 8 on Paul's letter to the Romans. I have the privilege of speaking to you from Haskell Hall at the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer in Ruston, Louisiana in the United States. I'm the Reverend Frank Hughes, and I'm priest in residence of this parish. This class on Romans is going to have 8 sessions. Today is the first out of 8. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll see that we're going to look at Romans 15:14 through the end of Romans. And if we can, we will get to the first 15 verses of Romans. But we're going to look at the end of Romans today. And the reason we're going to do that is because, actually, Romans chapter 15, verse 14 and following is where the travel plans are. And since this is not a church that Paul founded, the travel plans are the only indication of any local details. See, in authentic Pauline letters, there are always local details about that local congregation. And so, since Paul did not found any church in Rome, and probably he did not think that any apostle did either, then the only local details you get are in 15:14 and following with the travel plans. You do get local details also, depending on how you interpret them, when you look at the greetings in chapter 16. On the tables here, you'll see books that look like this, and this is the Revised Standard Version. The older RSV came out in 1946 for the New Testament, and then in the whole Bible in 1952. And the Episcopal Church asked the National Council of Churches if they would kindly translate the Apocrypha too. And so they did. And then in 1971, the second edition of the New Testament was published. And that's the edition that I became familiar with when I was in seminary in the 70s. So the RSV New Testament second edition is a very accurate translation. And then the RSV was revised in 1989, and then it's been updated again recently, and you can get the updated edition online, and during the SBL annual meeting in November in Denver, I'll get a copy of the NRSV UE, the updated edition, which I've already looked at online. And so now and then you will hear me saying something that doesn't really agree with the English text you're looking at. And the reason it doesn't is because I'm looking at the Greek New Testament. And on the other page, the opposite page, I've got the NRSV and I've got the Revised English Bible. So anyway, that's if you hear me say something that is in 15:14 that doesn't agree with what you see in your maroon RSV second edition, it's because I'm looking at the text rather than a translation. And that's what we clergy should do. Clergy should be taught New Testament Greek in seminary. When you look at the New Testament, the New Testament is a collection of collections. And it may actually be a collection of collections of early Christian writings. And the New Testament is the earliest collection of early Christian writings. And the earliest collection within the New Testament, and the earliest to be written and the earliest to be collected, is the collection of the authentic letters of Paul. And then later, after Paul died, there were other letters written in Paul's name because they esteemed Paul very highly, and there were problems and controversies within Pauline churches, and so they needed to write some new letters by Paul to settle some of the problems that they had. But the longest letter in the Pauline corpus and the first letter in the order that you find the Pauline corpus in the New Testament is Romans. It's right after Acts and right before 1 Corinthians. With the exception of the Dutch radical school of the 19th century, the authorship of Romans has never been doubted. And the hardcore Paul is the first 4 of them listed. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. The first really scientific book on Paul in 1845 referred to these four as the Hauptbriefe, the main letters, the head letters, and it referred to all the rest, except for the pastorals, as the Deuteropauline letters. They were a second level of Paulinism. It referred to the pastoral letters of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus as Tritopauline. And of course, nobody with any respectability for more than 100 years, no one has thought that Paul wrote Hebrews. You can be morally certain that Paul didn't. And so the ones that are the authorship, the letters whose authorship is debated a lot is the Deuteropauline letters of Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. I wrote a doctoral dissertation about 2nd Thessalonians. And then there is some debate among more conservative scholars than I am about the pastoral epistles. Romans is very distinctive. Romans was written to Pauline congregations that Paul himself did not found, and which may not have been founded, as far as Paul is concerned, by any apostle. Let's take a look at Romans 15:20 for a moment, as well as some greetings. But look at 15:20. Let me read it for you. Thus, I make it my ambition to proclaim the good news, or to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, so that I do not build on someone else's foundation. So Paul wants to preach the gospel in cities where Christ has not already been named. For Christ not to have already been named, it means that an apostle hasn't been there to preach the gospel of Christ. That's what that means. So he does not want to build on anyone else's foundation. In other words, he does not want to do to other apostles what the Galatian opponents and the Corinthian opponents have done to him. See? So Paul seems to think that to preach in a church, in a city, and there you preach Christ, you baptize people, and that is what it means to found a church, okay? An apostolos is a traveling church planter, okay? An apostolos does not stay stationary in a city. An apostolos literally is someone who is sent, a person who is sent out, apostolos. And therefore, if Paul says, I don't want to go and preach where Christ has already been named, and then later, if you keep on reading, verse 22, he quotes the Hebrew Bible in verse 21, and then verse 22, he says, this is the reason that I have so often been hindered from coming to you. And then he says, verse 23, but now with no further place for me in these regions, where he is as far east as he has been, right? There's no further place for me in these regions, because all of the cities that I want to preach in Christ has been preached in these cities, right? Either by me or others. I desire, as I have for many years, to come to you. And when I go, and then when I go to Spain, for I do hope to see you on my journey and to be sent on by you. To be sent on by you, it means I want money and I want letters of recommendation. It doesn't mean, goodbye, have a good time. To be sent on is he wants money, and he needs money for interpreters, and he needs people to write letters, people who have ends with the Roman government in Spain. We'll hear a little bit more about that. Now, and so the people that Paul is writing to in Rome apparently are people in Gentile churches that he knows from elsewhere around the empire. And he greets these people as if he knows them in chapter 16. And if these groups were not founded, in other words, if there are groups of Christians in Rome, see, the capital city, they've become Christians elsewhere. They've been baptized elsewhere. They've heard about Christ elsewhere. They've been telling the stories about Jesus elsewhere. They come together. Presumably they come together on the first day of the week. These groups, as a whole, were not founded by any apostle. And therefore, it's logical that these disparate groups of Jesus believers in the big city of Rome did not necessarily have the same understandings of the Christian faith and life. Now, if you don't believe that that's possible, just talk to Anglicans from around the world. I mean, there are 42 provinces of the Anglican Communion. And we have some different ideas about theology in the Anglican Communion. I would say we have some different ideas about theology even within this diocese. We won't go there. But nonetheless, when you have people who became Christians, Paul doesn't know where they became Christians, or he may have some ideas about where they became Christians. You could sort of expect that people in the Roman congregations, plural, did not have the same understandings of the Christian faith and life. And so, if indeed no apostle had been in Rome, because Paul says he wants to come to Rome, but he doesn't want to go where Christ has already been named. If no apostle has been to Rome to found a congregation in Rome, much less several, this would seem to be an excellent reason why Paul would write the letter to the Romans and would write such a comprehensive statement of Paul's understanding of the Christian faith. And therefore, Romans is not just about justification by faith. I mean, you find that in Galatians, but not 1 Thessalonians. It's not just about the death and resurrection of Christ. You find that in Galatians, and you do find that in 1 Thessalonians. It's not just about the meaning of the law of Moses, or the gift of the Holy Spirit, or the fact that Abraham is the father of all of us who have faith. Paul has already argued that in Galatians. It is about all these topics. Justification by faith is introduced in Romans 3:21 and continues in chapter 4. The death and resurrection of Christ is dealt with at length in chapter 5 and chapter 6. The meaning of the law of Moses and the whole issue of sin and being forgiven of sin or not is in chapter 7. The gift of the Holy Spirit is what chapter 8 is about. And the fact that Abraham is the father of all of us who have faith is what Romans 4 is about. And therefore, these are all important topics, and they were crucial to Christians of any and all ethnicities, right? If you're a Gentile Christian, and there are people in your congregation or people that you've heard about who are believers in Christ, and they are circumcised and they're keeping kosher and you're not, you need to deal with some theology there as to what is the meaning of keeping kosher, right? And Paul talks about that in Romans 12 through 15, right? If you are Jewish and you've always been a Jew, and Jesus is the Messiah of the Jews, and you believe that Abraham is your father, and you're keeping kosher, and when your kid is born, you get him circumcised on the 8th day, and you read the Hebrew Bible, either in Hebrew or more likely in Greek, and you've never heard that Christ is anything other than the Messiah of Israel, and you've heard the saying of Jesus that finds itself in Matthew 5:17. Think not that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fill them up. And the problem with the scribes and the Pharisees is not that they keep the law too rigidly. The problem with the scribes and Pharisees is that they do not keep the law rigidly enough. And your tzedakah, your righteousness, has to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. Thus says Jesus in chapter 5 of Matthew. See? So there's all sorts of theologies going on, either in the published letters of Paul, copied letters of Paul, copied from other churches, and also in the oral tradition of the sayings of Jesus. And it was the oral tradition which later gave rise, by the late 1st century, to the written Gospels. So there's lots of theologies going on in first century Christian groups. And therefore, somebody needed to, I don't want to say Paul wrote a systematic theology, but somebody needed to write something that would be equally applicable to the majority of Christians who were Gentiles and the minority of Christians who were Jewish. There needed to be a way to put Jewish believers in Jesus together with, or at least not at war with, Gentile believers in Jesus. Okay? And that is the reason Romans is as comprehensive theologically as it is. Not that it's a systematic theology, it isn't. But the real deal is, if you end up having a good understanding of Romans, you will end up with a pretty good understanding of the Apostle Paul and his theology. You will later come to see how that is a little bit different from Colossians and Ephesians and other letters. And if you have a good understanding of Romans, you will probably have a real good understanding of the Christian faith as a whole. Not everything that you'd like to know or that the church would like you to know about the Christian faith, but you will really be up there. You will really be like you ought to be. And all of us as Christians, we all are supposed to constantly be continuing our Christian formation. That's true of priests, it's true of deacons. I hear tell it's true of bishops. They even have a college for bishops. And we all of the clergy are required to have continuing education. So all of us need to constantly learn more about the Christian faith, and why not start with the Bible? To reiterate, Romans has chapters and verses in it that are of importance to any and all Christians. These include sin and what sin does to us human beings. Romans 7, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death?" The flesh and how it is related to sin, also in Romans 7. The Holy Spirit, chapter 8. Justification by faith, chapters 3 and 4. Teaching about the person and work of Christ, especially chapter 5, but also chapters 1, verses 3 and 4. And then how we Christians are supposed to live out our faith. Romans 12, 1 to 15, 13. Okay? And therefore, how has Romans been studied? An important part of it is the fact that it's the longest and most comprehensive statement of Paul's theology. Paul says more and more systematically, or more seemingly systematically, more comprehensively, about Christ, sin, justification, baptism, and the meaning of baptism, the Holy Spirit, etc. in Romans than anywhere else. Okay? Romans is the biblical book that has generated more secondary literature than any other biblical book. Secondary literature is what people like me say about the Bible. In other words, books and articles and commentaries are secondary literature. The primary literature is the text. This means that there are more articles, commentaries, and other books on Romans than any other book of the Bible. And my teacher, Robert Jewett, spent 25 or 26 years writing his commentary on Romans, which is big pages, and it's about this thick, about 2 inches thick at least. And he told me the last time we talked about his bibliography on Romans, which he wanted that commentary to be published in 2 volumes, and he wanted a 3rd volume to be published just of his bibliography on Romans. He did not get his wish. And he said, well, I've pared it back to 2,000 pages. Not 2,000 entries, 2,000 pages, single-spaced. Okay? Probably an inch margin all the way around, single-spaced. He pared it back to 2,000 pages. And that is going back to the early 19th century. Okay? So there really is more stuff written on Romans than any other biblical book, which is a little scary, isn't it? And in the Reformation of the 16th century, Romans, as well as Galatians, as well as other Pauline letters, went to the front of the class. Justification is that part of Christian theology that teaches that God justifies sinners like us on the basis of the sinner's faith, apart from the sinner's performance of the works of the law. And justification by faith became the major tenet of Protestant theology in the 16th century, as taught by Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon wrote the Augsburg Confession. John Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. Martin Luther translated the entire New Testament into German and wrote many books. Thomas Cranmer wrote the 39 Articles of Religion for the Anglican churches, and also wrote the first two books of Common Prayer in 1549 and 1552, before Bloody Mary killed him, as well as other reformers. And so justification is the most important theological idea of the Reformation of the 16th century. And because of the central role, apparently, of justification in Protestant theology since the 16th century, there has been a very strong tendency to make Romans into an overall handbook of Paul's theology, or of Christian theology. And Philip Melanchthon, who was perhaps a greater theologian than Luther, but who was perhaps the greatest Lutheran theologian, Melanchthon referred to Romans as the Christianae Religionis Compendium, the compendium of the Christian religion. And so Romans has tended to be seen in a timeless way outside of any particular pastoral context or the context of Paul's relationship with any Christians in the city of Rome. In other words, it has been seen in a non-situational way. It has been seen in a kind of a timeless way that it's the compendium of the Christian religion. I don't want to denigrate its theological character or its theological importance, not for a moment. But on the other hand, if you're going to interpret it as a writing from the first century, late first century, wouldn't it be great if you could look at it as a situational letter? And so in the late 20th century, many Pauline scholars, especially in North America, as well as other places, both Roman Catholic, Anglicans, Protestants, and others, began to see all of the letters of Paul in more situational ways. All of the letters of Paul were looked at situationally rather than trying to build this once-for-all theology of Paul, which would be the theology of the Bible. And so, since we have learned to interpret Galatians and 1 Thessalonians and the Corinthian letters as fully situational letters, why not also try to discover the situation of Romans? And that was explored in great detail by many people who wrote articles, including Bob Jewett, including Carl Donfried, in the book of essays edited by Carl Donfried, some of them translated by Donfried, called The Romans Debate. He was a participant in the Romans Debate, and then he put together that set of essays.
Could I ask one thing here?
Sure.
When you're referring to discover the situation of Romans, are you talking about the Roman people and the Christians in Rome, or are you talking about this writing in particular?
The reasons why Paul wrote the letter to the Romans at that time,
okay,
and the way he wrote it.
So it's the writing rather than the church in Rome.
Well, we'd like to know about the church in Rome, but therein lies the problem. But we're really interested in what the particularities of the letter to the Romans are, and any ways in which we can relate them to the particularities of congregations in Rome, both Jewish and Gentile, if we can. Okay, great question. One thing that happened, a young scholar named Peter Lampe, who just retired a couple of years ago from the University of Heidelberg, wrote a book called Die Stabbrömische Christen in den ersten 3 Jahrhundert, which meant Romans of the city center of Rome, Christians of the city of Rome in those centuries. And so it was translated more recently into English as From Paul to Valentinus, Christians in Rome in the first 2 centuries. And that was a watershed in the study of Rome because he identified from archaeology and ancient sociology and all manner of other ways, he identified neighborhoods in Rome, hills in Rome, and neighborhoods in Rome where it is likely, on the basis of inscriptions, that Christians lived. See? By the way, Valentinus was also a Christian, and he was a very famous Gnostic heretic. We learn from Peter Lampe, that many Christians in Rome were of a lower socioeconomic grouping, and many were slaves and many were former slaves. When Peter Lampe went from the University of Kiel to the University of Heidelberg, part of his going to Heidelberg included a DFG grant, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft grant, and Bob Jewett went as a Gastprofessor or a Gastwissenschaftler and had an office right under the library at the University of Heidelberg. And so Bob Jewett was essentially a researcher and Gastprofessor closely related to Peter Lampe at the University of Heidelberg. But Lampe's research was published as Die Stadt Römische Christen in 1987 in German and in 2003 in English, and it showed the existence of many house churches in Rome, both in regular houses and in tenement houses, which are apartment houses. Older research some time ago had shown that some of the house churches were made up of Jewish believers in Jesus, and that most of the house churches were Gentiles. By the way, you can find out what neighborhoods were of a higher socioeconomic grouping. Do you know one great way to find that out? Look for the bakeries. It's only in neighborhoods of higher socioeconomic status where there were bakeries. No kidding. And so a lot of research has been done, and what Lampe did was to collect it all and comment on it all, and to really come up with a really good sociological profile of Roman, Jewish Christian, and Gentile Christian congregations in Rome. And so when he did that, the walls shook. That's how important it was. There are many indications that the majority of Roman Christians were Gentiles. In 14:1 and in 11:17 and following, it makes it clear that the Gentile majority was discriminating against the Jewish minority. And the problem was there was this emperor in Rome named Claudius. And at one point, Claudius issued an edict that all Jews had to be kicked out of the city of Rome. If you were Jewish, you could not stay in Rome. You could not be in Rome. You could not stay in Rome. Many of the original members of Christian congregations in Rome were, in fact, Jewish. They were Hellenistic Jewish. They were not Palestinian Jews. They didn't speak Hebrew. They spoke Greek. Some of them spoke Latin. But they got kicked out of Rome. They had to leave Rome because of the edict of Claudius. Okay? Claudius died. And then after Claudius died, the edict of Claudius kicking Jews out of Rome was no longer legal. And so Jews could come back and live and work in the city of Rome, including Jewish believers in Jesus. And so Jewish believers in Jesus had been in leadership in Roman Christian congregations when they had to be kicked out. Then they were coming back, and Bob Jewett has certainly argued that they were not being given leadership positions in the congregations that they had been practically founders of, because they had to be kicked out of Rome. Okay? So as a result of that, there was discrimination happening by Gentile Christians against Jews, and especially fellow Christians who were Jewish. And so that is one of the important things to note about this letter, because in the last part of the letter, chapter well, almost the last, chapter 9, 10, and 11, the most difficult part of Romans, he talks about the fact that Paul says he would give up his own salvation if his fellow Jews would come to accept Christ. No kidding. And he also says that the Jews are the natural olive tree, and Gentiles who became believers in Christ have been unnaturally grafted into the tree. And God's, and so what happens is Paul is writing chapters 9, 10, and 11 to Gentiles to tell them not to disparage Jews. And so he says, well, by the way, if certain branches of the olive tree were lopped off and you were grafted in, if you're unfaithful, you can be lopped off too. How about that? So Romans 9, 10, and 11 especially, in fact, in one place there he says, now I am speaking to you Gentiles. How about that? So Romans 9, 10, and 11 is the most difficult part of Romans by far. And it is a part that is convincing Gentile believers that they have to show respect to Jews, to Judaism, and to the literature of Judaism, namely the Old Testament, which, by the way, Paul quotes the Old Testament in every single letter of his, except 1 Thessalonians, which is written to an all-Gentile congregation, as he says in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, and Philemon, which only has 25 verses. Okay? So Paul cannot be disparaging Judaism if he's constantly quoting the scriptures of Judaism, right? So exactly how you kind of unpack that and understand that is part and parcel of trying to unpack and understand Romans 9, 10, and 11, which is the most difficult part of Romans. In 15:14 through 33, Paul is asking for help in his congregations in Spain. He says in 15:14 and following that he wants to go to Spain and he wants to be sent off by you guys in Rome on his way to Spain. In Spain, Paul could not speak his mother tongue, Greek. Paul would not be able to preach or teach from the existing Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. And by the way, Spain at this time was made up of three distinct territories which were organized and governed in very different ways. And so my teacher, Bob Jewett, argued that Paul wrote Romans to get the Roman churches, Roman Christians who worshipped and gathered in separate house churches to cooperate in supporting his mission to Spain. Not to form a single Roman congregation, but to cooperate with other Roman congregations. Because only a relatively unified group of Roman churches, or at least Roman churches that were not fighting against each other, could be of any real support to his mission to Spain. Churches that are competing with each other, that is not helpful in evangelizing the world. We 21st century Christians, we need to remember this or discover that for the first time, okay? And so Paul was not writing to a single church that he had founded, but to Jesus believers who worshiped in different house churches. And the many, many, many people he greeted in Romans 16 were people he either knew or knew of from elsewhere around the Mediterranean. Some Roman Jesus believers were Jewish. The majority were Gentiles. Paul wanted to do away with the rivalry between churches. Here is a map of Spain. By the way, I love this map because everything's in Latin. And you can see Spain is divided into four parts. The four parts are like this: Hispania Ulterior, or Baetica. This province had the largest group of Italian immigrants and produced many cultural leaders in the empire. Hispania Citerior, or Tarraconensis, was the largest colony of the Roman Empire. A large portion of the population was not Latinized until long after Paul's time. Lusitania was the third province of Spain. By the way, the Anglican Church in Portugal is called the Lusitanian Church. It's one of the 42 provinces of the Anglican Communion. And Lusitania was the least urbanized, and it was ruled by a legate of lower rank. And Bob Jewett commented in his commentary, big commentary, a large portion of the northern and western portions of the peninsula was not Latinized until long after Paul's time. The Iberian alphabet and dialects remained in use in the inner regions of Spain until they were gradually displaced by Christian missionizing in the 6th century CE, and thereafter, with some regions retaining their linguistic distinctiveness until the Middle Ages. They didn't speak Greek, and many of them didn't speak Latin, and they hated the guts of the Romans. Is that clear enough? And so, if Paul had tried to speak Latin, well, as it turns out, there have been revolts in Spain against the Roman Empire. There had been many bloody revolts, and so it might have been a good idea not to try to speak Latin to these people who had fought bloody wars against the Romans. Imagine that. In areas where Latin was spoken, however, Paul would have had to have an interpreter if he would decide to preach in Latin, and that's very debatable. By the way, there's no evidence for any substantial Jewish population in Spain until the 3rd or 4th century CE. Therefore, there were no synagogues for Paul to visit, preach in, and try to establish contacts in for patronage. The stuff that Paul does in Acts, he constantly goes to the synagogue and preaches on Sabbath days, right? Well, he preaches in Greek, right? And he preaches mostly, many of the people he preaches to are Gentile God-fearers. A God-fearer is somebody who is a Gentile who does not get circumcised. And therefore, there was no network in Spain of synagogues, and therefore no network of God-fearers, of Gentiles who respected Jewish customs and could read the Hebrew Bible in Greek, in the version known as the Septuagint, which was translated into Greek in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. And therefore, the distinctiveness of Romans is that there was more and greater difficulties associated with Paul's mission to Spain, primarily to Gentiles, since we don't know that Jews were there at all. More and greater difficulties than Paul had ever encountered in his well-known and successful missions to the Eastern Mediterranean. And therefore, you can posit that Paul needed to create a document that both Gentile and Jewish believers in Jesus could listen to and read and find to be equally true. Otherwise, as Paul thought, there was no real way to unify Roman Jesus believers. If you don't give people a theological or religious base, some baseline things to believe in, then how are you going to unify these congregations who have been founded in different places elsewhere by other apostles? See? So Paul has to sort of write something that will establish the theological baseline, and it would be something that Jewish Christian believers and Gentile Christian believers could more or less agree on, kind of a manifesto of Christianity. Okay. He also says in Romans 15:14, I have fully proclaimed the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem as far as Illyricum. Well, if you translate that literally, it's, I have preached the gospel of Christ from Jerusalem in a circle as far as Illyricum. In other words, the circle is Mediterranean cities around the Mediterranean Sea. The Romans called the Mediterranean Sea either Mare Nostrum, our sea, or Mare Internum, the internal sea. And they call the world the Orbis Terrarum, meaning the circle of lands. The circle of lands around the Mediterranean Sea. Paul says, I have proclaimed the gospel of Christ going around the circle as far as Illyricum. And I make it my ambition to proclaim the good news not where Christ has already been named, so that I do not build on someone else's foundation. This means that Paul prefers not to go where another apostle has founded the church already, to do to them as others have done to him. And sometimes we refer to this in 1520 as the non-interference clause. And yet, in 1523, I desire, present tense, as I have for many years, to come to you. I want to come to you, but I don't want to go where Christ has already been named. And therefore, if you take these two verses seriously, Paul apparently didn't think that another apostle had been in Rome by the time that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans in about 60 CE. Okay? The other thing that Paul does is that he introduces Roman in 16. In chapter 16, he greets a bunch of people. Okay? And he recommends Phoebe, and he refers to her as a diakonos. This is the same word that he refers to himself and Apollos in 1 Corinthians 3:5. No one has ever suggested that Paul and Apollos were deacons, okay? So why suggest that Phoebe was a deacon, or even worse, a deaconess, especially because the word diakonessa didn't exist, as far as we know, until the 4th century CE. So if Paul and Apollos, who are apostles, are diakonoi, which should be translated not as deacons, but as ministers, guess what? So is Phoebe. She is the minister of the church at Cenchrea, which is one of the 2 port cities of Corinth. And therefore, the correct translation should be minister rather than deacons, unless you're willing to call Paul and Apollos deacons, which we are not. Okay? And then there are greetings. There are a bunch of names that are Greek: Prisca, Epaenetus, Andronicus, Stachys, Apelles, Aristobulus, Herodion, probably a Jewish Greek name, Narcissus, Tryphena and Tryphosa, Persis, Asynchronous. All of those are Greek names. There are some Latin names: Aquila, Eunia, Ampliatus, Urbanus, Rufus, and Julia. Some of these people with Greek and or Latin names may well have been Jews. They were Jewish. They just had Greek and Latin names. Why? They're in the Roman Empire, see? And they want to do business in the Roman Empire. So they may have had a Jewish name, but also a Greek name. Paul did, see? And so the question is, who are these people? They seem to be people that Paul knows from other churches that he's founded in his many travels around the Mediterranean Sea. No one does more traveling and founding churches than Paul. He is the master. So Paul has either heard of these people or he knows them. Maybe he baptized some of them. And therefore, in chapter 16 and in the end of chapter 15, this is the only place, pretty much, that you get local details about local congregations. These people may only have been in Rome when they were traveling there on business trips. Paul at least thinks that they are there sometime during the year. And they're there and they make signs to each other, you know, and so they group, they worship on Sundays surreptitiously. They may be worshiping in synagogues, surreptitiously perhaps. And so they're Christians that Paul has heard about orally, and that's the people that Paul is greeting in Romans 16. By the way, in Romans 16:7, Andronicus is a male name. Eunia is Andronicus is a Greek name. Eunia is a well-attested Roman name, and it's a female name. And people who translated the Bible couldn't believe that Paul would be saying of a man and wife team, apparently, that they are well known among the apostles, because they couldn't believe that Eunia was an apostle, although it's a well-attested Roman female name. So they invented a name, Eunias. But we don't know that that name ever existed, because it says greet Eunion. Eunion is the accusative case. Normatively, if it's Eunion, the nominative case is Eunia, right? Right. So Eunias was the invention of biblical translators in the King James Version and others who refused to believe that a woman named Eunia, perfectly good Roman name, was an apostle. And then it says she is well known among the apostles. Some people don't like that, and they say she's well known to the apostles. But it doesn't say that, because the preposition in is there. It says episemoi en tois apostolos. And so that should be, she is well known among the apostles. If the preposition in was not there, and it was just epistemoi tois apostolos, you would translate that very reasonably as well known to the apostles. And it would be a dative case. In other words, it would be a direct object. But in tois apostolos, in governs the dative case, and therefore here it's in meaning among the apostles. And so the newer translations all say she and her husband Andronicus are well known among the apostles. And the fundamentalists and the very conservative evangelicals hate that a lot. And as far as I'm concerned, they can just go ahead and hate it. I don't care. There's also a question of whether 16, 17 through 20 is interpolation. Bob Jewett is convinced that it is. And then there are greetings at the end from Paul's colleagues in Romans. Paul's colleagues where he is to the Romans. Everybody doesn't read and write. And then that's about all I want to say. Well, we have to quit now. We do, however, have 2 minutes for questions. Two minutes. Here are some questions that I thought would be interesting. Well, what questions do you have about Romans? And of course, you can't ask questions about Romans without asking questions about Paul. I mean, Romans is a letter from to Roman congregations, such as they are, by Paul. So when you study Romans and you say something about Romans, you also presumably are saying something about Roman congregations, as Peter Lampe has shown. Well, I've talked too much. One of the things that I would also want to say is that if you believe in Paul as an apostolos, and primarily what he does, he goes and founds congregations by preaching the gospel. Is that theology or is that practice? Guess what? It's both. If you want to be a Christian and you want to practice ministry, you've got to know something about the practice of ministry, oh yes, but you also got to know something about Christian theology. So the division that some people do believe in, may they rest in peace, hopefully soon. Some people do believe in a division between theology over here and practice over there. And I'd like to tell you that I've spent 40 years trying to destroy that division. And I hope to spend 40 more years doing it. So I think it's important to understand how to do ministry, but how can you understand how to do ministry until you understand what it is, what kind of God that you are representing as you do ministry, see? And you can only do that by careful reading and study of the Bible. Well, it's now 10:05. Some of us have to get dressed and go to church. And next week, we will start at the very beginning of Romans and go through 3:20. We have to quit at 3:20 because 3:21 is where justification by faith begins. So anyway, thank you very much.